I'm really happy to be back. That was one of my favorite speaking events I've ever participated in, and I was very well received, welcomed, and I can't wait to dive into this topic of what's next or what's new since I've been there. Just in terms of, for those of you who don't know me, let me just introduce myself and tell you how the background from which I'm coming to you. My undergraduate work was in pre-medicine and nutrition science, and I went looking for a nutrition-based medical school and found Bastyr University. It was the only medical school I could find that had a strong nutrition program. And so I practiced kind of nutrition-based neurology for 10 years in a private practice in Seattle, and then I got an award from the government to leave practice and go into research. So for the last 8 years, my main emphasis has really been on doing research in neuroprotection, nutritional strategies for neuroprotection in Parkinson's disease. So I have done a couple of clinical trials in intranasal glutathione. I've been collecting research studies on different Parkinson's disease-related projects, and I got a master's degree in public health and epidemiology and my PhD in neuroscience these last 8 years. So my focus has really went from clinic to academic, and now I'm kind of bringing them all together and trying to find ways to improve clinical practice based on what the research says. So the topic I was asked to talk about today is what's new. Since I've been up there and went up to British Columbia and gave this talk, what are the updates and what's new? So all of my disclosures are on these slides. I think these slides will be available to you after. One of the things I wanted to do is just start with the summary. At the end of this, when this is done, this is really what I'm going to tell you to do: to exercise daily, to engage socially, to be a part of groups where you are expected to be someplace, practice mindfulness daily, get a good night's sleep, eat a plant-based Mediterranean diet, and work with your providers to choose which supplements you need to be on and keep all your docs informed about what you choose to do. So we'll circle back to that at the end. I'd say two of the most exciting things that have happened in the last year or so have been this spring as part of, it wasn't a part of the American Academy of Neurology meeting, but while the American Academy of Neurology meeting was happening in Los Angeles, the Parkinson's Disease Foundation supported our first ever integrative medicine think tank. And we had about 35 people come together. Patients were represented, conventional neurologists, physical therapists, naturopathic docs, psychiatrists, acupuncturists. It was the first time that I'm aware of in history that conventional and integrative medicine patients, practitioners and patients got together in a room to say, let's get on the same page. What are you doing that's working? How can we study this? What's the best strategy for integrating this into our practices and learning from each other? And so that conversation, it took place over a couple days, and I think it was really exciting for me to see that the future of medicine really is integrative. There is no question that evolution is happening, and integrative medicine is really going to combine what we know, what you're getting from the defensive strategies you're getting from your conventional doctors, partnered with offensive strategies in terms of what's causing this disease in the first place, is really where we're all headed. So that was exciting. And the other thing that has happened in the research field that I think is incredibly exciting is that we finally understand what alpha-synuclein is. We always talk about alpha-synuclein being Parkinson's disease being an aggregation of misfolded proteins. And so what's happening is this protein, alpha-synuclein, is misfolding and clogging up your cells. You can't clear this misfolded protein in time, and it eventually gunks up the cells enough to cause cell death, right? So there are a lot of pharmaceuticals in the works right now that are targeting how can we decrease the buildup of alpha-synuclein in the first place. Well, in fall of last year, we finally got our first hint or evidence to say, hey, we now know what alpha-synuclein is. Your body makes it in response to intestinal inflammation, and it in turn causes a lot more intestinal inflammation. So I think there has been this growing idea that Parkinson's disease starts in the gut and spreads to the brain. I think it is a whole new level of understanding to know that this protein that's causing the whole thing, really responsible for the spread of this disease, is actually coming in response to GI infection. And so the relevance of that is going to become a lot more apparent as we kind of talk about some of the work that we're doing in research from a holistic naturopathic perspective. So I introduced this scale a couple years ago. I think one of the problems we've had in research is that the outcome measures that we use don't necessarily reflect this severity of your Parkinson's disease. When you go into your neurologist or your research appointment and they ask you to tap your fingers and slap your hands on your legs, it's a nice snapshot, but it's a 5-minute snapshot in a highly fluctuating disease, right? If we did that same test at 8 o'clock in the morning or between doses of meds or post-medication, you're going to get really different scores. And one of the problems that we've had in Parkinson's disease is not only how much these scores fluctuate over the course of the day or the week, but how you don't even develop motor symptoms at all until you're kind of late into the disease. So even if we could, take the same tests at the same time every day in a very stable person, we still are studying something that's happening 10, 20 years into the disease. So this scale that we developed is really has allowed us to ask questions differently, study rate of progression differently. And what I want to draw your attention to is the diversity. I don't know if you can see that my arrow playing around on the field, but what this slide basically says, or what this scale basically tells us, is that patient scores are somewhere between 0 and 2,500. And so what happens is if your score is below a 500, statistically, that our data tells us that people who are saying my score is less than 500, I hardly have any symptoms of Parkinson's disease, and my quality of life is excellent. Right around year 10, the average person crosses that 1,000 line and goes, good now becomes fair. And so you can see people at diagnosis have a score of about 580, and they're getting worse at about 38 points per year. But you can also see there's a big variation between where people are at. There are people 15 years post-diagnosis who hardly have any symptoms, and their quality of life is excellent. And so we're trying to study who are those people and what's different between those folks and the people who wind up with really high scores in that pink zone called poor in the first few years. Why are some people progressing faster, some people progressing slower? So this scale has really opened up a whole bunch of doors to us. Early detection. There are a bunch of us now that have dogs that smell Parkinson's disease. We are working on identifying what it is that they're smelling, figuring out how early can they smell it, how often are they right, how often are they wrong. But there are dogs from the UK to, I have 2 dogs. There are some in Friday Harbor, San Juan Islands. So there are lots of folks who are really, we all use different strategies. The folks in Friday Harbor are using T-shirts. I'm using mostly earwax, but this is a picture of my dogs identifying the T-shirt of somebody who slept, the T-shirt that someone overnight had worn with Parkinson's disease. And as most of you have heard by now, there's a woman in Scotland who first kind of brought this idea to light. And quite a few patients and partners have come forward saying, oh yeah, of course, I can smell it too. And so it's actually quite reliable. So what does it mean and what can we do with it? And what there really is looking like is what we want to do is be able to diagnose this early. This straight, solid black line is the typical rate of Parkinson's progression based on, we surveyed over 1,000 people, and this is what most people are progressing at a rate of about 38 points per year. You can see with the dotted lines what a 50% decrease in slope looks like. if I say, hey, if you start exercising 30 minutes a day, 7 days a week, you can cut your rate of progression in half. That's great. That's great. If you get started the day you're diagnosed and you cut your rate of progression in half, that means that 25 years later, your score is only going to be about a 1200, not a 1500. It makes a difference. But if we can get the dogs to identify people who have premotor Parkinson's, 5, 10, 15, 20 years before they develop their first tremor, look at the difference between a 50% reduction in slope. That same daily exercise, which we should probably all be doing anyway, but if that same person were to start, doing something that causes a 50% reduction in slope, that means it's going to be another 45 years before they're even symptomatic enough to be diagnosed. I mean, they really buy themselves a ton of extra time, and we start opening the door to prevention. So I think that this concept and this paradigm is a really exciting turn of events in the integrative medicine community. It speaks to prevention is now on the table. The other thing that we're doing at Bastyr that I am really excited about is this idea of having a place where our patients with Parkinson's can come and just do it all at once and check themselves in for a week and get the package. Get medical care, get all the blood work they need, find out if they're deficient in things, find out if they have too much of some things, if they're on the, have a movement disorder doc, talk to them about their choice of meds or their doctor's choice of meds, participate in physical therapy programs and rock steady boxing, experience biofeedback and acupuncture. And so this is our second year of hosting something called Parkinson's Disease Summer School. And it's a picture of people doing Tai Chi one morning out in the yard. And so we are seeing really exciting results. We're following the outcomes of the people who came last year. We have 2 more weeks scheduled for this year, and we are seeing that there is a clear difference in terms of how people's scores change in these 6 months and following following participation in summer school. So what we're starting to work on now is, how long do those changes last, and can we reproduce it? Can we see that again this year? And I think what we're ultimately working towards is a program that, it's in your insurance company's best interest to offer you, like a dietary counseling for a person who has diabetes. It's an education and an intensive education program. Invested in early on actually saves a ton of money and negative health outcomes over time. So that's what we want to find out is, does it work as well as we think it's going to? And how can we scale this and make it more available to more people? And can we start offering programs like this in Canada and the UK and the East Coast? So that's really exciting to see how successful that was last year and the interest we've had this year. So bringing to the published research now that we've done in follow-up from the last talk I gave in British Columbia. I presented on data that had not yet been published when I was up there. For those of you who didn't hear that lecture, just to recap, what we're doing is we are currently following 1,800 people all around the world who have a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. And we send them a survey every 6 months, and we ask, who are you? How are you? What are you doing? Who are you doing it with? And we wrote statistical code that helps us identify who are the people who progress quickly and who are the people who with the slowest rate of progression. So that study is still enrolling. Anyone who wants to help us better understand Parkinson's disease and participate in this trial, it's completely internet-based, and it takes about an hour and a half every 6 months to fill out the survey. So today I want to tell you what we're finding in that survey. So with the first 1,000 people that we had enrolled, we're now up to 1,800. What we see is that the more days per week of exercise you do, the slower your Parkinson's disease progresses. What is really interesting, there are 2 really big pieces here. One, these data suggest to me that the first 2 days a week of exercise don't really do much in terms of slowing the rate of progression. For those of you who go to a yoga class twice a week, you go walk a lake with your friends twice a week, you might get some social benefits from that. You might get some cardiac benefits from that. But you really don't appear to be getting any Parkinson's disease modification benefit from that. It is not slowing the rate of your progression, these data suggest. To get disease modification effects, you really need 3 days a week, at least. And what we see is people who do 4 days a week are progressing slower than people who do 3 days a week of exercise. So every day matters. People who do 7 days a week of exercise, at least 30 minutes a day, are doing better than people who only exercise 6 days a week. So what type of exercise is best? And what we saw is it seems to be different for everybody. There's a huge chunk of people doing something that we're not asking about. People have found their own unique patterns and preferences and things that they've invented that they like to do. And so people who say, I do my own thing that's not on your list are doing really quite well and having a slower rate of progression. Yoga very consistently comes out as one of the better forms of exercise. Yoga and Tai Chi. So what I take home from that is there is other data that suggests intensity matters. Breaking a sweat, getting your heart rate up, really having target heart rates. And I think there is some truth to that. We see that here in the cycling program has a 300-point impact in terms of how much it slows Parkinson's progression. That looks great, but there were only 11 people in our survey who were doing the program, participating in that intensive cycling program. So even though the data looks really good, I'm hesitant to say too much about it with so few people participating, but still it's exciting and it speaks to that intensity. That's the 80 to 90 rotations per minute. But the other thing that's really impactful is the yoga and Tai Chi effects. That tells me that exercise isn't just about dripping with sweat and getting your heart rate up, that there's something else that is playing a role here. These are just some examples. I said, people said rowing, Parkinson's disease exercise classes, tennis, Pilates, calisthenics. Okay, so when I'm counseling patients on exercise strategies for Parkinson's disease, what I tell people is, yes, at least a few days a week, you do want to try and get your heart rate up and break a sweat. But I also talk about lymphatic drainage. You really remember, every cell in your body has its own metabolism. It takes in nutrients, it does things, it makes energy, and it excretes waste. And when your cells make waste, that goes into your lymphatic system, all up and down your limbs, your arms, it's in your brain, it's in your gut. And so there is this constant system of drainage to clear your body of its own self-made toxins and waste products. And every muscular contraction, every twist, every turn, you really help clear that waste. One of the other things that seems to be a factor in exercise is the cognitive focus. Things like dancing, not dancing, but ballroom dancing, to salsa, tango, things that really require you to concentrate on your footwork and your rhythm and your partner, are things that seem to be more useful than mindless exercise. So things like Tai Chi and yoga, rock steady boxing, dance, things like that require a lot of focus. That seems to be one of the magic ingredients in what makes a great exercise program in Parkinson's disease. And the other thing that the research is telling us is that if you really want neuroplasticity, you want your adult neurons to sprout new branches, you have to leave your comfort zone. If you are good at it and you are comfortable in that room, you are probably not growing much brain. If you go to a Zumba class today and you're the oldest person in the room, you don't know the routine, you're turning the wrong direction, you can't keep up with the rhythm, your legs aren't responding to your brain, and you really just feel like a fish out of water, that's actually great for growing new brain. I mean, it is honestly this idea that your body, you don't want to humiliate yourself. And so when you put yourself in an environment that is strange and uncomfortable and you're risking humiliation, what happens is your brain says, hey, if she's going to pull stuff like this, we better sprout some new neurons, right? And so really part of the exercise prescription is not just about the sweating, but really participating in something that makes you feel awkward, physically awkward, emotionally awkward, and not stressed, but uncomfortable, so that you really are send your brain the feedback system to sprout some new branches, I'd say is the best way to say that. The other thing that our data says is that social health is more important than we realize. I mean, if you look at the impact of people who are doing, all other things being equal, people who do 7 days a week of exercise are about 245 points lower on that pro-PD scale than people who don't exercise, right? That's a pretty big thing. That's, 8 years worth of, change, I'd say. Compare people who say I am lonely are 323 points worse than people who say who aren't lonely. I mean, loneliness is a really, really big issue in Parkinson's disease, and I was actually really surprised to see how impactful that is. Ever since I've started peeking at these data, I've really gone out of my way in clinic to make sure that part of the prescription for patients is that they plug themselves into a social network. I don't care if it's church. I don't care if it's dishing out soup at the soup kitchen. I don't care if it's, playing chess with your neighbor who is can't get out of the house for some reason. It doesn't matter what you do, but you have to plug into your community and have a role and make yourself needed to other people. So that has been something that I think has been a really new emphasis in my clinic. As you can see, certainly being overweight is not in your best interest. But a patient of mine said as long as he has a lot of friends, he can be overweight and they'll cancel each other out. So we don't know how this is all going to work, but you can see the things that do make differences in terms of slower or faster rate of progression, and some of those things you can change. I mean, I'd say all of those things you can change. And if you being a little more outgoing and reaching out to a few more people is part of your medicine, I'd say that's a pretty easy pill to take. So as I mentioned, my academic work, my PhD is really in nutritional medicine and Parkinson's disease, and I put a lot of work into trying to figure out what is the best way to study what people are eating and how it's affecting their Parkinson's rate of progression. The first thing I'll say is it is really hard to study nutrition. If somebody puts, or it's really hard to study diet. If someone puts a plate of lasagna or casserole in front of you, it is so hard to know what went into that, how much salt, how much cream, how much butter, what kind of cheese, was it organic or not when you're at different restaurants. It's hard, it's really difficult. So there are different ways that researchers use to study nutrition. What we chose to do for this study is break it up into these 10 categories. Never less than once a month, 2 to 3 times a month, once a week, 2 to 4 times a week. And so what we kind of look at is the frequency that somebody reports intake. What we see is the people with the slowest rate of progression, the people who 10, 15 years late after diagnosis hardly have any symptoms and their quality of life is excellent. They are eating a ton of fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, nuts and seeds, non-fried fish, olive oil, coconut oil, wine, fresh herbs and spices. I'd say the first thing, when people see this list, the first thing most people think or say is, I eat all that. As soon as people see that list, people want to tell me how they eat all that. That's not the question. The question is, what percentage of your diet comes from that list? The people who are really, really doing well, this is most of what they eat. And the more of this you eat, the slower Parkinson's progresses. So people who are having non-fried fish once a week are progressing faster than people who have non-fried fish 3 or 4 times a week. So this is really exciting data. It was published in 2017, and it is the first time in 200 years of Parkinson's disease that we actually have data that says from the point of diagnosis forward, there are decisions you make, things that you do that affect the rate of Parkinson's progression moving forward. So this is, again, in terms of prescriptions to take, seems a pretty easy one. And I do want to say it's not that easy. I mean, I say it's easy, and come on, how hard is it to eat, a little bit of lox and some broccoli? But I do want to acknowledge that it is difficult from a different angle. It's more expensive in the short term to have a plant-based diet. The food rots quickly. There are no preservatives, so you have to eat it fast, or else you've paid for something that's going to be moldy in a week. That means more trips to the grocery store for people who have mobility issues. That can be a huge issue. The food prep, it is way easier to eat fast food, to throw frozen food into a microwave, than it is to chop and saute a bunch of vegetables, right? And so I acknowledge, especially if you have a movement disorder and your hands don't respond as well as to the brain's commands as well as you'd like them to, that can be a really stressful, exhausting process, is to prepare food by hand that requires a lot of chopping. If you are used to Mountain Dew, blueberries don't taste that sweet. So as you make a shift from artificially flavored foods to naturally sweetened foods, I would say that the foods initially taste bland and boring. I think family support is a problem. I was just thinking about my dad told me once that he would rather die 10 years early than eat my rabbit food. And we all make our choices, but it does taste maybe like rabbit food, and that lack of family support can be really hard, especially if you have kids in the house or you have a partner who doesn't want to eat your health food. They want to stick to their old ways. It becomes even more stressful and expensive to make 2 meals or to ask one person to eat what they don't want to eat. And then there's just the not knowing what to eat. We're talking about, we have 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years of habits now. And so now to find new foods can be a stressor. And for people who weight loss is a really big problem, especially later in Parkinson's disease. And sometimes when people don't know what to eat and they don't want to eat anything bad, they just decrease what they eat in general, and that makes a bad problem worse. So these are all things that need to be addressed. Just eat healthy, I realize, is not as simple as it sounds, and I want to acknowledge that. I also do think it's as simple as it sounds. So for the statisticians who might be interested in the impact, what I've done is just laid out the actual numbers here for you to look at. This is the name of the publication. This is, if you Google the role of the name of this title, Diet, Nutritional Supplements, and Parkinson's, the full text of this article is available for free, and it kind of goes over the details of this study and what we learned, also about supplements and things like that. Partners that play for points. I'll just say I think that's really clever. I have a patient who the husband was being very sluggish about making some dietary changes that his wife was enthusiastic about. And so she made him a bet, and they got competitive about it. But every time they have one of the things on that list, every time you have a half cup of fresh vegetables, you get a point. Every time you have 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, you get a point. And so they now, every day they play for points, and the person who gets the most points each day gets a foot massage from the person who gets fewer points. And so every day they're having this little contest, like who can get more good, healthy, neuroprotective, apparently, foods in their body, right? And it's just been a fun way to find new recipes. And when you're hungry, you throw a handful of cashews or raisins in your mouth. So that's a fun little way to do that. And the point of this slide is just to show you that it doesn't have to be complicated and expensive. Cloves, one of the reasons we think fruits and vegetables and spices and herbs are so good for you is because of these antioxidants called polyphenols. They are really high in spices. It is not hard to have a cup of Bengal spice tea or peppermint tea a few times a day, and you really improve the nutritional content of your diet. This is inexpensive, it's convenient, it doesn't require a major lifestyle change, and I use this as also a great excuse to have more dark chocolate in your life, because it's pretty high in the polyphenol content. Along these lines, I know that depression and apathy, being a little depression is common in Parkinson's disease, and traditional antidepressants clearly don't solve the problem the way we wish they did. There have been two really large-scale studies on whether or not changing to a Mediterranean diet improves your mental health, and both studies showed really impressive improvements in depression scores. When you stop eating what we call the standard American diet, abbreviated SAD, or a plant-based Mediterranean diet. And if you go back, if you just look at, I started throwing around the word Mediterranean diet, but that's exactly what this is. The foods that are statistically associated with a slower rate of Parkinson's progression are essentially the Mediterranean diet: fruits, veggies, nuts and seeds, non-fried fish, olive and coconut oils, wine, herbs and spices. So all of the research, I think if you're out at the bookstore and you see books on the Mediterranean diet, that's really what we're talking about. So we are starting to talk about, how do we package this? How do we deliver this? What does this mean? You can't write Mediterranean diet on a prescription pad and send somebody out the door. People want to know how much bread is in there, and does it have to be a certain type of fish? And what about scallops? And so people have a lot of questions, and physicians have not been trained in nutritional counseling, and nutritionists haven't been trained in neurology. And there aren't PR departments and marketing departments that can kind of help infiltrate the conventional community and promote the Mediterranean diet. Like, it's not like a pharmaceutical drug where we have those systems in place. We actually just don't know how to package and deliver things like dietary modification. So we're working on that, and I think that's we're getting closer. On the bad list, the foods that are associated with the fastest rate of Parkinson's progression: red meat, dairy. So I'll just say there have been 5 studies now that say the more dairy you eat over the course of your life, 20s, 30s, and 40s, the more likely you are to get Parkinson's disease. Most every epidemiologic study that has ever said, are there environmental contributors to Parkinson's disease, has identified dairy. We don't know why. There are a whole bunch of theories. Could it be the calcium? Could it be the wrong microbiome from the cow being introduced? Could it be lactose intolerance? Could there be pesticides in the dairy? We don't know, but in addition to the 5 studies that say the more dairy you eat, the more likely you are to get Parkinson's disease, we now have the first data to suggest once you have Parkinson's disease, the more dairy you eat, the faster it progresses. So that's a big deal. When I presented in British Columbia, that wasn't the case. We only had, I think, 700 or 800 people in the data set at that time. And as more people have joined the data set, as more people have joined the study, the data gets better and better. And we now do see that there is a link between dairy and Parkinson's progression. Fried foods, soda, especially diet soda, canned fruits, and canned vegetables. Yes, sheep cheese. I'm starting to see some questions. Yeah. So the sheep cheese, thank you to whoever asked that. Deborah, thank you. So the quest for a loophole is the next slide. Everybody wants a loophole. What about, but the milk I buy is organic, but I only eat grass-fed beef. I've had people say, what about camel milk? Yeah, I think it is going to be never that we actually have an appropriately powered study that compares lifetime intake of sheep, goat, or camel milk versus cow milk. It's just not going to happen. It's like, I think the short answer is it's not worth the risk to me. I think mammalian breast milk, if you look at what the hypotheses are, they're in the last year, maybe even 6 months, 9 months, notable new research has come out saying that the calcium itself might be the problem. That even brings calcium supplements into question. But the calcium might be a problem. There is some pretty solid evidence that calcium causes dopaminergic cell death in both your gut and brain. So are we getting too much calcium? It could be the pesticides that we're feeding the cows, in which case, maybe organic's not so bad. If it's lactose intolerant, all animals are going to have lactase, or if it's lactose, all animals have lactose. So until we really know the mechanism of action, you're kind of gambling. But my advice is no breast milk from any mammal. Almond milk is fine, soy milk, cashew milk, hemp milk, rice milk. Any plant-based milk is fine, and that's probably even not good for you. I mean, it's still fortified with calcium, and it's processed, refined stuff, but it's a nice substitute to have that is actually, at least it's not associated with progression. So kind of think of that in terms of neutral. Yeah, same thing for game meat. So I think we don't know. I think my concern, Mary, about game meat is that it's the iron. I don't, it could be a lot of different things. But when we inquired about supplements, I don't have this slide, but we asked people what supplements are people taking causing faster, slower progression. And the iron is the only supplement people are taking that was associated with faster Parkinson's disease progression. And beef is the only meat that's coming up right now as being associated with faster Parkinson's progression. So that really makes me wonder if it's not the iron in the red meat that is one of the big drivers about that. If it is the iron, then game meat is equally problematic. So my advice is, I joke with my patients when they ask for these loopholes. Well, what about sheep cheese? What about game meat? What about I say it's kind of like telling a smoker with lung cancer who's saying, well, what about menthols? I only smoke lights, or I have filters on my cigarettes. It might be nice to think that some of those things offset the damage a little bit, but really my advice is there is no good reason to keep it in. You're playing with fire, and my advice is learn to eat without those in your body. And that brings us back to this idea. I told you at the beginning of this talk that we are really talking, one of the most exciting things is this intestinal inflammation leading to the production of alpha-synuclein in the first place. All of a sudden, these foods and foods associated with Parkinson's progression might have some real biological rationale behind them. If you have lactose intolerance and every time you have cream in your coffee, your gut is getting a bit inflamed, and that causes you to make more alpha-synuclein, and that in turn recruits more inflammatory down products that eventually spread from gut to brain. That means that we might want to be looking at the intestine as a target. How can we decrease intestinal inflammation? And it's not as simple as just changing your diet. I mean, I wish I could say, hey, all you need to do is switch to a Mediterranean diet. What we see is that a lot of people have infections, things like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, wrong bugs growing in your gut. There's a whole bunch of attention right now on the intestinal microbiome. And as I already mentioned, I'm really fascinated by this research on calcium causing problems with dopamine. So when you put it in that context, it's really not that hard to avoid these foods. The fried foods. I went to the grocery store the other day and asked my son talked me into bringing him home French fries, and so I stopped at the counter to order him an order of French fries, and the woman handed them to me and said, "Oh, and they're especially good today because we just changed the oil." And I realized, of course, they're frying that in oil back there. And I said, how often do you change the oil? Oh, every week and a half or so, 2 weeks. And I just realized, dozens and dozens of times per day, they're heating up that hot oil and using it over and over and over. And um, what must be in there. So anyway, I think that, when we are handed something like a French fry, we think, oh, this tastes great, right? We don't really think about the production and what's going into it. So it makes this food look a lot better when you start looking at it that way. Fresh is best. Just go fresh. Frozen seems to be neutral. Fresh fruit, fresh vegetables actually seem to be neuroprotective or associated with slower progression. As I mentioned, iron supplements were the only supplements associated with faster progression, and the only supplements associated with slower progression were fish oil and coenzyme Q10. But even for the coenzyme Q10, that benefit did decrease a little bit when we adjusted for income. And we don't know if it's something about people who can afford CoQ10 are doing something else, or it's just that CoQ10 is expensive and you need a little extra money to be able to buy it. So we're trying to work on what that means. But the people with the slowest rate of progression were supplementing with fish oil and CoQ10. I want to leave time for questions, so let me wrap up pretty quickly here and just say I think mindfulness is a really big part of what we need to do. It's not the same as praying or just spending time alone. Some really neat research has come out recently on this mindfulness-based stress reduction course. It's offered all over the world. You can take this 8-week class and kind of learn mind-body awareness. When they had patients with Parkinson's go through this program, and every single participant at the end of study participation said that they would recommend other patients with Parkinson's take the MBSR class. And, it was across the board, everybody should do this. There have now been 15 randomized controlled trials about Tai Chi and Qigong and Parkinson's disease. And across the board, the studies say that you have people who do Tai Chi or Qigong 2 or 3 times a week have improved gait speed, motor function, fewer falls, better balance, improved mood, less depression, and quality of life goes up. If this were a pill that improved gait speed, balance, depression, decreased falls, everybody would be demanding their doctor prescribe it. And what the studies are very clearly showing us is that 2 or 3 days a week of Tai Chi does that. So I think that's a really underutilized resource. They did a 3-month power yoga program of elderly patients with Parkinson's disease. They concluded that yoga significantly reduced slowness and rigidity and improved muscle strength and power. So I don't want to open this can of worms too late. I'll just say cannabis is really difficult to study. I did a study not specific to people with Parkinson's disease, but we surveyed, I think this is about 1,500 people who use cannabis medically, and we asked, why are you using it? The top 3 reasons that people used cannabis were for pain, anxiety, and depression. So in clinic, I find that my patients actually report that it improves sleep the most, and we have a paper under review right now where we had people wear a tremor sensor, an accelerometer on their wrist, and every time they used cannabis, they pushed a button. And we did see that an hour after using cannabis, people had reductions in tremor. And when we interviewed them at the end of the study, 9 out of 10 people said it improved their cannabis or their Parkinson's symptoms, and 6 of the 10 said specifically sleep was what improved the most. So in conclusion, I think the other thing I'll just say wrapping up is one of the biggest improvements I have seen in the last year or two is this huge, huge upswing in this sense of patient empowerment. I am seeing a whole new level of patients taking responsibility for their lives, for their care, for their medicine, for their medications. They are not going to their physicians anymore asking to have their disease be slowed, to be the rate be decreased. People realize real quick there is no medicine that is going to slow the rate of my progression, and if I want to do that, that's going to literally come down to me rolling up my sleeves and getting started, going to the gym, leaving my comfort zone, making new friends, eating new foods. And so I am really excited about how enthusiastically patients are accepting that challenge and responsibility. So summing up what we just talked about, you know, I again, every single day matters for exercise. 30 minutes a day, every day a week. Try to make it so that you stir it up, different things each day, and at least a few times a week. Do something that makes you feel awkward and uncomfortable. Plug yourself into your community. Be vulnerable. Make friends. Invite people over to your house for dinner. Have potlucks. Join book clubs. But really force yourself to get out of your house. Some sort of mindfulness-based practice every day. And for those of you who don't have experience meditating, I say take the MBSR course or start yoga or take a meditation class. They're all helpful teachers. Sleep, we didn't talk about a ton, but it is among the most important thing you can do to wring out your brain. You make a lot of waste products all day and you clear them out at night. So you have to get a good night's sleep. Foods, we've talked about what to eat, what to avoid. And supplements is a whole nother separate talk. And I thought instead of getting into that, I'm just going to say that's best to, in my clinic, we do supplements based on what people need. People who cover their skin need more vitamin D than people who don't. People who are on levodopa need to monitor their homocysteine levels a little more closely, and they'll have different B vitamin requirements. So that's kind of the summary of what I'm recommending. I'm starting to look through some of these questions. And Miriam, if you want to jump in and ask or say anything. Keen, I'm going to say in terms of carbs, they're pretty neutral. At least they are either neutral or we don't yet have enough people enrolled in the study to be able to tell you whether they are harmful or helpful. In terms of pan-seared or baked fish, so I think the key is not heating up oils too hot. So every oil has a different boiling point. One of the tricks is the closer the oil comes to oils that come from equatorial regions, avocado oil, sesame oil, peanut oil, things that come from equatorial regions can tolerate more heat than things that grow at northern climates. So canola oil is going to be more susceptible to heat in terms of damaging that oil and causing problems than olive oil. And olive oil is going to be more vulnerable than sesame oil or coconut oil. So the trick is to whatever oils you're cooking with, make sure you cook below the point that causes that oil damage. And if you poach fish or bake it, you can probably get away with lower temperatures and less of that. Calcium supplements certainly make me nervous, given some of the research that's coming out. I think, I love that there are these places in our conventional healthcare system where we're trying to give nutrition. Oh, let's give you extra calcium for your bones. Let's give you extra iron so kids don't get anemic. But I think that we have to take a step back and realize that's just not how human metabolism works. That's not how nutrition works. And we might be helping some issues while causing other problems. So if I have reason to believe that a patient of mine is calcium deficient, I would absolutely encourage calcium, mostly dietary calcium, green leafy vegetables, almonds, seaweed, things like that. But I am not a big fan of calcium supplements in clinic. For the Tai Chi and Qigong programs, the studies were standalone. Other people may have had other things that they were doing, but the results that I talked about were very specifically, if we just take 30 people with Parkinson's disease and 15 of them do Tai Chi 3 times a week versus 15 do a brisk walk. The Tai Chi people had better balance. Balance is the real thing that improves the most, I think, with Tai Chi. So yeah, I think stirring it up's a good idea, and enough people come to me after starting Tai Chi and Qigong and tell me they like it and it helps, that I would say anyone with Parkinson should take an 8-week class and at least learn the foundations, learn what it is, learn and decide for yourself if you think it helps. Sue, for the person who says she has MSA, I'll just say we are collecting, the study is also looking at MSA, PSP, LBD. We're looking at all different forms of Parkinsonism. And I will tell you, when we don't have enough people with MSA in the data set to be able to draw any conclusions, but I'll say that the number, whether we include folks with different Parkinsonism or not in the analysis, it doesn't change the analysis. It seems to be fairly similar. And the other thing that I'll say is the dogs that we have that smell Parkinson's, they say it's all the same. They identify someone with MSA and someone with idiopathic Parkinson's disease as both being a yes. So I think more and more we're starting to see that from Alzheimer's to Parkinsonism, these might all be different manifestations of the same upstream problem with protein aggregation and impaired clearing, right? So obviously the downstream, how the disease manifests is going to be different based on which proteins gunk up which cells in which regions. But the act of having the protein misfolding disorder seems to be similar across a huge host of neurodegenerative diseases. You're welcome. Yeah, the swimming was surprising to me. Swimming, we didn't see a statistically significant improvement. Certainly there weren't as many people swimming. It could be that we don't have enough people in the study yet. And it could be that swimming doesn't help as much as we think. So that's why we're doing more research. We're starting to add, we're about to revamp this a little bit and add Parkinson, PWR, and Big and Loud, and more of these programs that are kind of catered to. So we're going to improve the exercise data and also look at intensity. Do people said running, but do people who run 10 miles at a certain rate do better than people who run 5, jog 2 miles? Regarding the fish oil, any difference between EPA and DHA? So I put them together. I tell my patients, I'm hemming and hawing as to how I feel about medical recommendations here, but realistically, almost all of my patients, the vast majority of my patients in clinic, after I measure their blood levels of EPA and DHA, end up with a recommendation for 4,000 milligrams per day of EPA and DHA. If you take a combined dose of EPA and DHA at about 4,000 milligrams a day, that gets you into the healthy, normal blood levels I'm looking for. Osteoporosis is a whole separate issue, and I think bone issues in Parkinson's and bone issues in general are way more complicated than just taking calcium. It is true, if you're calcium deficient and take calcium, that will help prevent bone loss. It is also true that the more dairy any country consumes, the higher the rates of osteoporosis in that country. So we really need to have a conversation about vitamin D is what tells your body to take the calcium and send it to your bones. Weight-bearing exercise is a huge problem. So even things like food allergies. I mean, when we see people, one of the earliest things that we found about celiac disease and having wheat allergies is it's not just about gut stuff, but a lifetime of chronic gut inflammation affects what nutrients you absorb in your gut. So the bone health conversation is much more complicated, and even in people with osteoporosis, I don't necessarily recommend calcium supplements, but that's a very individual thing. It's hard to measure blood calcium. That's a complicated thing. That's very individual. Curcumin actually was on looks like it might offer a little bit of protection list, but it did not reach statistical significance. Yeah, none of those ones on your list. The ginkgo, AOT, lion's mane. I was not asking about lion's mane. I did ask about ginkgo. So some of these very particular formulas that I didn't know or don't know that people are using with a lot of frequency were not on the list. And right now, for the people who manually entered what supplements they're on, this study has no funding. We are all volunteering our evenings and weekends to make this work, and we don't have any work study students who can go through and analyze those data yet. Yeah, 4,000 milligrams total combined EPA and DHA. All right. Does timing matter for acetylcholine? No, it doesn't. And I love the idea of Just Dance. I think the Dance Dance Revolution video games and Just Dance are a ball. They are a ton of fun, and it's one of the only exercises I've ever done in my life where I didn't want to stop.
Well, Laurie, thank you. I think you answered most and hopefully most questions, and hopefully everyone who wanted to have a question submitted it beforehand. We are at time, so I do appreciate everyone's patience and participation also, as Laurie went through some really exciting findings, and especially in the variety of things that you've been kind of overseeing. And so again, thank you so much. As you can see in the comments, people are just so thankful for you to spend the morning with us. For those of